My name is Philip Ayub. I'm a professor of international relations in the department, and today we bring you together for a seminar titled Transnational Digital Advocacy. During the seminar, we're going to discuss how organizations like ABBA's and MoveOn are mobilizing members around the world and shaping public opinion on issues including climate change, trade, and refugees. And we're brought together in large part, by Dr. Nina Hall's exciting new book called Transnational Advocacy in the Digital Era, which provides a detailed investigation of how organizations like these work to shape politics today, as well as what sets them apart from the transnational advocacy networks that international relations scholarship has theorized in the past. For example, that they use that these modern groups are maybe able to be more reactive, nimble, multi-issue, and membership-driven than their predecessors. So we'll discuss these issues in this panel, where Nina will be joined by two leading practitioners and theorists of organized social activism, Dr. Duncan Green and Nat Whalley, to discuss the opportunities and challenges posed by transnational digital activism. So I want to introduce our distinguished speakers in the order in which they will make their remarks today. So first here we have Dr. Nina Hall, who is an assistant professor of international relations at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Her research explores the role of transnational advocacy in international organizations. She's author of the new book that I had just mentioned, which was published by Oxford University Press earlier this year. And she's also the author of a 2016 book called Displacement, Development, and Climate Change, International Organizations Moving Beyond Their Mandates. Nat Whalley is CEO and co-founder of Organised, a fast-growing startup on a mission to give everyone the tools, network, and confidence to improve their life at work. The vision of Organised is a world in which decent, fairly paid work is available and accessible to all, and where all of us are treated with dignity and respect at work. And last but not least is Dr. Duncan Green, who is Senior Strategic Advisor at Oxfam Great Britain and Professor of Practice in International Development at the London School of Economics. He is author of How Change Happens, also published by Oxford, but in 2016, and From Poverty to Power, How Active Citizens and Effective States Can Change the World. His daily development blog, which I would also recommend looking at, can be found at oxfamblogs.org//FP2P. So the format, the way this works is Dr. Hall will speak first and has a little bit more time, around 7 to 10 minutes, and will be followed by Nat and Duncan's remarks at around 5 to 7 minutes each. I will give you a 5-minute warning, which means you've already used 5 minutes, just so you know how to orient your time a little bit. Then we're going to have a panel discussion of about 20 minutes, where we in the panel can engage with many of the themes you raise, before I turn it over to the floor, where we'd be thrilled to have your questions and comments for the panel. The final note before I hand it over to our first speaker is that the whole session, including the Q&A, is recorded and will be posted online to the department's website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast after the event. So just please keep in mind that the conversation here is public, including beyond this space. And if you speak, you'll be heard in the recording. We'll also let you know about when the recording is available, and hope you might want to share it with others. So thank you so much, and we'll turn it now to Dr. Hall.
All right, can you all hear me? Welcome. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to the organisers of this event at UCL, to Fergus and to Philip for hosting me, and both to Duncan and Nat, because having worked on a book for 5 years, it's very exciting to be able to share the book with you all, but also to get respondents who have thought about these issues to ask questions and to challenge it. So also all of you in the audience, please do challenge the book and ask good questions. For those of you who are wondering what you're here to listen to, I've spent 5 years writing a book about a very distinct type of organisation. And these are organisations that exist over the entire world, but the first one that was established was MoveOn in the US in 1998. Now, out of curiosity, have any of you heard of MoveOn or any of these organisations on this list? Not many, which is fine. We're all here to learn, and neither had I when I started this project just over 5 years ago. I didn't know much about them either. But what struck me when I did hear about MoveOn was that it had a very distinctive model of advocacy. It was different from what I'd learned about in IR, sitting for many of you as students, learning about politics, reading books like you might take classes on advocacy. What I was reading was stuff that Duncan knows well about the ways that Oxfam campaigns. But what I noticed with MoveOn was quite different. Here are a few factors, and I'm going to go in more in depth in my talk. One is that they collected people's emails. So they set out a petition and said, you know, we want to save the climate, or we want to mobilize people against the Iraq War, back in the Iraq War days. People would sign an online petition, but that petition, that email that you signed up with, wouldn't just be used for that one campaign. It would be held for future campaigns. So MoveOn's resources became its members, who were people who signed up to petitions, and then MoveOn could mobilize them, not just on the Iraq War, not just on climate change. It could be against Trump's refugee and immigration policy, or around LGBT rights, or around a local issue like saving a local library. And what's important is that MoveOn was not the first to do online petitions, but that it set up an entire organization around this model of collecting emails and using those to then campaign subsequently on progressive issues. These are all progressive organizations. What's also important about MoveOn is that it developed a distinct type of activism, which David Karp has written about, called analytic activism. Analytic activism, in a way, is what most of us are familiar that Netflix or Amazon do with us. They feed us books that we think we'll like, or movies. A similar thing can happen in activism. MoveOn can test what issues people care about most. And they can do that by seeing what you open, which emails. They can test subject lines. Do you care more about the climate if you say climate change will harm the penguins, or climate change will harm future generations? Oh, everyone cares about the penguins. That's the email we'll use. Now, I'm going to go more into this model in depth, but the reason I outline it is it's very distinct. And I got curious because it was sort of throwing up a lot of questions about how activism is operating in the digital era. And then I also noticed that MoveOn, while it's a US-based organization, there were very similar sister organizations in over 20 countries worldwide in this list. And it struck me how fascinating that the same type of organization that uses emails, that does digital analytic testing, existed in places as disparate as Romania, Israel, South Africa, New Zealand, Sweden. There's a bunch more. And I also noticed that a lot had been written about, well, a fair amount, in political communications about these organizations. So I've named David Karp, who wrote this book, The MoveOn Effect, which showed how MoveOn had a big impact on American political advocacy. Yet none of my IR scholars seemed to know about this. And I thought, what's going on here? I got even more interested when I realized that these groups weren't just operating online. So a common misnomer or reaction to my work is, oh, you're talking about digital activism. Isn't that just all slacktivism? What fascinates me about these groups is they're mobilizing people online as well as offline. And I think that that distinction between the online and the offline isn't always actually so useful, because most NGOs, whether it be Oxfam or whether it be MoveOn, are operating in both spaces. But what was distinct is that they were using these digital analytic tools to mobilize people on very different causes in large numbers, often as part of domestic coalitions. So they're not the only groups. But to give you an example, Campact, the German organization, mobilized 250,000 people to protest against the Transatlantic Trade and Intellectual Property Agreement. Now, this was one of the biggest protests in Berlin since the Iraq War. This is the Brandenburg Gate. You can just see a little bit of here, and this is going to the Tiergarten. I was actually here, so it's an aerial shot, and this is one of their founders, Christoph Baltz, a spokesperson. Now, I should note that Campact has been cited by conservative commentators, as well as scholars, as one of the key groups mobilizing public opinion in Germany against the Transatlantic Trade and Intellectual Property Agreement. There was a huge public uproar about that agreement. Meanwhile, in Poland, not that far away, but on a very different issue, Aksja Demokracja, the Polish group, was mobilizing people to defend the rights of judges to stay till the end of their term. It may sound quite a technical thing, but it was a very important piece, a decision coming out of the Polish government that was part of sort of trends towards democratic backsliding. And in New Zealand, you also had protests against the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So what I noticed is these groups were mobilizing people offline and often, not always, shaping public opinion. As an IR scholar, I became fascinated because it's a global phenomenon. They have large memberships, over 20 million supporters, 1 in 15 domestic voters in 19 countries. So the question that the book essentially asks is, to what extent or how do these organisations challenge our theories of advocacy? I use participant observation, going along to meetings. This is me actually here in one of the open meetings. I'm not sure if Nat is at this one. Nat is,
not that one.
Nat is in the book and was at some of these summits. This is just in the hills outside Vancouver, where activists would meet for a week, and the importance of meeting face to face and discussing was central and is a central part of the book. It's not to say that everything can happen online. We all know that after COVID. And I've done over 100 interviews. So in my remainder few minutes, I want to outline just one chunk of the book, it's really one chapter, and put forward 4 ways that these groups challenge, at least in international relations, the way we think about advocacy. The first is, conventionally, NGOs don't engage in election campaigning. They're apolitical. They need to work with whichever party gets into power, right? If it's the Conservatives, if it's Labour, they need to be able to work with them. They also have charity status. This is a great recent article that's come out by George Mitchell and Hans-Peter Schmitz making this point. As a charity, you can't engage in political activity because you'll lose your charity status, right? There's legal rules around that. Now these organisations, digital advocacy organisations like 38 Degrees in the UK, or MoveOn, or Get Up, are very different. They actively engage in holding politicians to account when it hurts them most, during the election season. And they do things that you and I are probably familiar with in terms of political campaigning. Door knocking, they have volunteers going around and canvassing. They host big forums with the candidates. MoveOn hosted the first big plenary with all of the presidential candidates from the last election cycle, the last presidential election cycle. Get Up contributed, I argue in the book, to a former Australian Prime Minister losing his seat. And they do this also using digital tactics, figuring out where is the most strategic place to focus their campaigning. So that makes them different, right? They're different because they engage actively in pushing for progressive candidates and trying to oust conservatives. The 3 other elements really fit together closely. I pull them apart for analytical purposes, but they all fit together. The groups that I study in the book are all rapid response. Being online helps that, right? They can launch a petition within hours. And I saw that in my ethnographic work, going into one of the offices of the Austrian group, Aufstand, that literally launched its campaign within a couple of minutes. This compares to very long-term commitment campaigning, where groups over a long period of time think about women suffragettes. They're not just going to give up from one day to the next campaigning for women's rights to vote or human rights issues. You keep on it. The groups I study are multi-issue, so they bounce from one issue to the next, depending on what their members think is most important. And that comes back to that point about member-driven. They're member-funded, members take the actions, whether it be protesting on the streets or tweeting. And they listen to those members using digital analytics. In fact, one of the quotes in the book is, every email is a survey. Every time they send an email, it's receiving and they're listening for information. And I argue in the book that that forms a kind of digitally networked power. They're not just broadcasting what they're doing online. They're not just sending out a report and saying, here's our report. They're actually trying to harness people, what they care about in a specific moment, to sign a petition like this petition that 38 Degrees ran in 2015 to save refugees. Now, so far I've been describing it analytically. You might think, I think these groups are the most amazing and they're going to change the world. There are strengths to this model I argue in the book and weaknesses. And one weakness that I highlight in the book is that they pivot so quickly that they care about the refugees one moment, but they don't follow through and make sure that, say there's a refugee win from the UK Prime Minister, that he actually follows through and implements it. Because they pivot because people start and end up caring about these. And I saw this in 38 Degrees, that their surveys responded that refugees were top for a little bit, and then bees became the most important issue, so you leave the refugees on the wayside. So to conclude, the book argues formal political organisations matter in the digital era. It's not all algorithms, it's not all social movements, horizontal networks, You need to understand decision-making in formal political organisations. And we have a distinctive model that's spread worldwide, defined by member-driven rapid response multi-issue, whose powers from mobilising, and they operate online and offline. I have lots more to say, but in respect of the timekeeping, I'll keep it to that, and I look forward to your answering questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. I absolutely love that. So my name's Nat. I run a company called Organised, and Organised is basically founded on a lot of those principles of those kind of rapid response digital campaigns. My background, my first job was at Avaz, which is one of the ones Nina mentioned, and I worked at 38 Degrees. I did this comment at a Manla, the South African version of this. So I'm probably quite biased coming to this, I think. I now run a company based on these principles, so like take that with a pinch of salt, give me some good challenge. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Organised, but I'd also love to later dig in on the refugee stuff. That was my campaign, and challenge some of that stuff about like long-term impact that these campaigns can have. But I'll start with talking about Organised. So Organised is a relatively new company. So we launched in 2017, but we took off in the pandemic. Our mission is to give workers the tools, the network, and the confidence to make change happen in their workplace. And we do that with a series of online tools. So you might think, workers get a lot of representation from trade unions, which they do. Organised isn't representing workers. We're giving workers the tools to represent themselves. And that's a lot of this. There were the three principles you talked about there, like rapid response, member-driven, and I can't remember what the third one was.
Multi-issue.
Multi-issue, yeah. So that's a really important principle of Organised. So we have the tools. The tools are things like open letters, petitions, surveys. You see a lot of these things go viral where someone does like a salary survey and it's like on a Google sheet and it goes round, or an open letter written on a Google form that goes round, it gets loads of signatures. And they're powerful because they have impact, but the power within them dissipates. And it comes back to that principle of like what MoveOn we're doing. It's like every person who takes an action on Organised, they give us their email. They also, the kind of new twist we've done on the model, is they give us their employment status, their industry and their workplace. So we're building out this network of people who are connected. They might not know each other personally, but they can talk to people who they can build power with. So if you think of Facebook's built on a social graph, who you know. Nextdoor is built on a local graph, people you are geographically close to. Organised is a network built on top of your worker graph, so people in your industry, your sector, or your workplace, but you don't necessarily need to know them. And that's one of the important principles of power. You being able, as an Amazon worker, to reach out to another Amazon worker in a warehouse who you'll never meet, and say, so this is a real example we had last year, every day when I leave the warehouse, I have to walk past these mountains of good, like brand new washing machines, brand new TVs, all under this banner that says destroy. I hate this. I find it really demoralising. I walk past this. Is it just my warehouse, or is it happening in other warehouses? And historically, as a worker, you have no way of figuring that out, right? You're miles apart, you're 200 miles apart, how are you going to know? That worker came to Organise and ran what we call a snap poll on our platform. We had no idea this was happening, right? Because we're distributed tools. So it just says, I'm going to ask other Amazon workers, I see this every day, anyone else seeing it? And instantly, within like 2 hours, there were 200 Amazon workers across the country who were like, yeah, I've seen it and it really winds me up as well. And then they're connected and they're talking to each other. And that's where it starts to get powerful. So they ran a petition. They set up a petition that's like, can you give the goods to charity or give them to the workers? Like do something other than destroy them. They run this big petition, and I'm with you. Petitions don't create change, but what they do create is a community of people you can mobilise to take action that's impactful. So of those like 50,000 petition signatures, thousands of them are Amazon workers who then run a bigger survey to map the scale of the problem. How many goods, what kind of goods, and how frequently are these things being sensitively destroyed? They take this, they compile it. We work with ITV to run this report. They take it to Amazon. Amazon's first response is, oh, it's the label on the bin. It shouldn't say destroy, it should say recycle. They're going to, what's it called, like energy to waste or whatever. It's basically where you burn things to generate energy. It's like the worst form of recycling ever. And they're like, just a problem with the label. And the workers are like, it's not up to us as Organised to decide what happens next. The workers vote. And the workers are like, that's not good enough. I'm not taking that. So they carry on running the campaign. They take cameras, 10 of them take cameras in to work with them and film the lorries being loaded with these goods. And so that comes back to the point about like real activism along kind of the digital stuff. To build evidence to show that these lorries are going to landfill. The ITV follow the lorries to watch them go to the landfill site. So like at this point, Amazon are backed into a corner. And I love that about that, it's like, 50,000 people on the petition. Actually, it's only 10 of them who are doing the nitty, like the dirty, like activism stuff. But it's so impactful, and they know that 50,000 people have their backs. And that's what gives them the swagger to do it. Like doing that on your own is terrifying, but doing it when you know you've got 50,000 people in your corner is empowering. So yeah, this happens in the course of like 2 weeks since they've launched their campaign. Within a month, Amazon and Now have changed their policy not just in the UK, but in France, Spain, and the US. And that's why this stuff is powerful. For like multinational companies being able to build a piece of data that then changes their policy, like it's so cool. And what I love most about it is because it's member driven, like that was their words, it was their actions, they voted on it. Every single one of them now has a swagger that they take into future campaigns. So when they see something else in work that they're not happy with, they're like, actually, I know what to do about this. I'm going to go and ask and see if anyone else has the problem. And it compounds, and that's the exciting thing about this kind of model, I think. Is that my phone?
It's just 5 minutes. Keep going. Yeah.
So yeah, that's an example of like how the model can work really well. So yeah, we're organised, we've been going, we took off in the pandemic. We've got 1.5 million members in the UK. So they skew towards sort of low pay, so generally retail, hospitality, transportation workers, that sort of thing. A month ago we opened our office in the US, so we're based in Brooklyn. We've now got 20,000 members in the US and it's starting to grow organically. And I think the exciting thing about this is every action someone takes on Organised, if it's something about their workplace, they bring in their colleagues and that compounds, right? So those colleagues bring in 2 more and that's the exciting thing. And our vision is that one day Organised will be 1 billion workers. We'll be able to see problems up and down supply chains. And the data we have, like coming back to your point about like being data driven, the thing I'm so excited about is if we had 1 billion workers on this platform with real-time data, they're sharing this stuff, we can start to do things like predictive access to justice. So we can give people, using the data we have, the tools they need ahead of the time they need it, so that in that moment of crisis, they've got the advocacy tools they need to create the change they need. So yeah, that's our vision, that's Organised. And it's all built on the open model.
Thank you. All right, Duncan, I'll turn it over to you, and we have to make sure that...
Is working? Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so I overdid it in the gym and I'm completely knackered, so I'm going to sit down, if that's okay, and talk from here. I hope that's all right, except we've got... Yeah, can you turn that off?
How do I turn that on?
Great, okay. Thanks, Nina, thanks, Nat. A few comments on the book, I think. So up until now, the benchmark really has been New Power by Henry Timms and Jeremy Hymans. It's a fantastic book, thoroughly recommend it. But what reading Nina's book highlights is some of the gaps in that sort of Bible on digital activism. And the main gap she's identified in the name is this transnational new power, because all the examples that Hymans and that Timms and Hymans use are national, and that's a very big sort of central theme in Nina's book, is that these organizations are aiming at national governments, and they're not really very clear on international work. And some of the things I liked about the book, I liked the counter to Gladwell. So Malcolm Gladwell famously critiqued the slacktivists and said, you're not going to walk towards the guns because you're a Facebook friend with someone, talking about the Arab Spring. And that point that Nina mentioned is that digital activism has now become a gateway to deeper forms of activism. And maybe it replaces some of the traditional paths of activism where people would get involved through their faith groups, through their trade unions. Now there's this other way in, another way for people to become involved and then move on to deeper levels of organisation. I thought that was very interesting. But I still think that at the big change moments, it'll be smaller, long-lived organisations like trade unions or faith groups or women's associations or neighbourhood associations, which will still be fundamental. The change isn't just going to happen through this stuff, through those demonstrations. Those demonstrations come and go, as we saw from Occupy. It's what else is going on that makes a difference, I think. I really liked the way the book holds up a kind of digital mirror to the analog world politically. So it talks about digital social movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter, digital political parties like 5 Star in Italy and Podemos in Spain, digital advocacy organizations like MoveOn and Avaz. I would have liked to see more about the interactions between them. I mean, if it's created this whole digital universe where it's kind of replicated the kind of categories that you see in analog politics, then there must be lots of really interesting dynamics going on between those social movements, political parties, and advocacy organizations. These advocacy organizations target nation states as the locus of power, as Nina puts it. They don't actually target the multilateral order. They don't do much on the UN, they don't do much on the World Bank or the IMF. They don't do much on the World Trade Organization. So on the one hand, that makes sense. It's something I've argued a lot over the years that, NGOs like Oxfam, who I worked for in the past, massively overestimated the importance of these global circuses like the G7 and the UN and so on, and that change is primarily national. So they've got that right. But there are big collective action problems like climate change, tax, intellectual property around the COVID vaccine. So I think there's going to, a question for me that comes out of this is, will there be a convergence between the NGO concept of advocacy and and these new organisations? And as Nina herself says, there are risks of going where the energy is, because the energy is often about bees and not often about Yemen, right? So or China. And if you're targeting states, you can't target China. So there's big limits to what this model can target. And I'm sure that all the people involved would accept that. You can't target everything, I was not entirely convinced about, here I'm going to get defensive now about the NGOs, right? So digital has the power of numbers, NGOs have the power of expertise. Well, a lot of people don't think the NGOs have that much expertise, but putting that aside, they have other strengths. One of the big strengths is media work, so they create the impression of public interest and public pressure. Another one is membership. The RSPB, which has just been doing this fantastic work on the attack on nature, is the biggest mass organisation in Britain. It has over 1 million members, and it's an NGO. So, I think, that's a bit simple. What I wanted more of. Nina talks about the analytics, but I wanted to know more about how these organisations do analysis, right? There's a lot more to understanding how change happens than just A/B testing of headlines in emails. So how do they do power analysis? How do they do stakeholder mapping? How do they decide who to target? Is it, do they target a politician, civil servant? How good are they at this kind of stuff, which is the stock in trade of advocacy organisations, or do they just hurl numbers at things and hope that something sticks? The criticism has been that, and I want to know if there's more to it than that. I've just been doing a big training course with the UN, right, on this whole question of influencing skills and analysis to help people in the UN target their attempts to influence governments more consciously, more intentionally, using their brains, right? So how much is that happening? And then the other conversation I had last week was about shrinking civic space. In many countries, there is an enormous attack on CSOs, an attack on civil society organisations, an attack on civic activism. So is it the case that these kind of approaches are taking place in a shrinking universe? Because if you do this in more and more countries, if you do this, you'll get shut down. So I want to know what's the model, how does this work in Vietnam? How does this work in Ethiopia? Or does it not? And you actually just basically talk about the US and Europe and a couple of others. So just how are they looking at this question of civic space, which is a really massive headache for all of us? Some questions to Nina and Nat just occurred while they were speaking. How do privacy laws affect all this? I've just done yet another online training about GDPR, the EU privacy regulation. Does that make it harder to do all this stuff? You can't keep these emails for infinitely. You have to, or is it easy to get around? This digital convergence question, there is a convergence between advocacy and digital, especially what we saw in COVID was a lot of organizations that had previously been analog moving to digital forms of advocacy. So as that sort of jump-started the convergence. And also, this may just be I'm out of touch, but I hadn't heard much about these guys. 5 years ago, we were constantly being lectured by Avaz, for example, who massively overclaimed and wound us all up by just saying, we bring down governments. You go, actually, there were some other things going on there. But I haven't heard that kind of language, and I haven't heard much from these organizations recently. Is that just me, or has something changed?
Thank you. Thank you all for these 3 fantastic presentations. And Nina, I know you already have some questions there as well, but I think we'll open the panel where I have a few questions, and we'll do maybe 2 short rounds of those where any of the speakers that want to respond or engage with each other can. Then we'll open it to the floor. I have some other questions as well at the end if we still have more time, but I don't want to take up too much. Nina, your book was such a joy to read and really interesting. And one of the things you bring up at the end was something that really was with me for a while in the book, is that a lot of times in transnational advocacy, there's contestation over these issues, and the tools, including the new tools that are developed, are mimicked sometimes by the opposition. And a lot of my work on LGBT transnational advocacy, and you can think of the online platforms like All Out that work on those issues, had been met with several groups. The main one, Citizen Go, which is started by an anti-abortion Spanish NGO group that now has this online platform that has websites in 12 different languages around the world, and really does a lot of work in a similar way to that you described, transnational issues, but really localizes them in different domestic contexts with their specific audiences. And we know we live in a really, in a media environment where a lot of disinformation spreads and where there's a lot of contestation also in terms of who's picking up messages. And a lot of our conversations today were around, these movements on issues that make us feel a little bit better. And I'm wondering how you think moving forward this is going to work with this new digital transnational advocacy when we have more and more groups maybe using these tools to push in different ways in the international space. So I'll start with that.
All right, are these working?
They should be.
Yes, no? Yes, excellent, okay. Thanks all, so many questions. I think I'll make 3 points, but I don't want to go on too long just because I know that there's a eager audience, and I thank you both for the additions and questions. Thanks, Duncan. I have lots of responses in detail, which we can talk about afterwards if I don't get through them all. The first thing I think I want to clarify is the transnational dimension, because I didn't mention in my talk, but about half the book is about how these distinct national groups, MoveOn, 38 Degrees in the UK, Get Up in Australia, collaborate. And the point that I make, which Duncan alluded to, is that they all have national memberships. They're all accountable to those members for funding and for their members to take action. And so that the way that they campaign transnationally is to share tactics, to share messaging, to share technology. But they don't form common campaigns with all of the membership in the US, Romania, New Zealand, South Africa, at the same time campaigning on the same issue with the same target. Now that's important because when we tend to think about international campaigns, say climate campaigns, it's a whole lot of climate activists descending on the UNFCCC, the climate negotiations, to take an action on the same day, or the WTO protests, all on the WTO. And what I'm trying to make a more nuanced point within the literature, that transnational campaigning can happen at a domestic level, and they're still connected. They're connected because these organizations are formed a network called Open, but they're not all, every member sitting in New Zealand or sitting in the UK, part of a same action targeting an international institution. The reason it's a little bit complicated, I understand, but the reason I make this point is because there was often an assumption that we'd see a global civil society emerge, that the internet would mean borders would be irrelevant and we would no longer, need to think about national priorities because we would all hold hands and be part of this global civil society. And my book's trying to push back against those claims that were particularly strong in the late 90s and early 2000s. I think these days, people aren't that convinced by that argument, but I want to systematically show that this kind of early 90s progressive emphasis is that there are problems in it. And I also want to make a point that there is power in organizing domestically, because just on something like climate change or tax justice, most of the decisions, of course, are happening in London or in Paris or in Berlin or in other capital cities. And so actually it's a strategic, there is a theory of change there. There is a power analysis, and the power analysis is exactly that. If we mobilize citizens on the streets to hold democratically elected decision makers to account, that's where we have the most power. I can go on, but I just leave you with one image. A powerful protest of this kind, I think, is like Fridays for Future, the student climate strikers, all on the same day, same issue, but you don't hear the student climate strikers saying, do this at the UNFCCC. They focus on their national governments. And then getting on to the second point is just the relationship with some of the more conventional NGOs. In the book, I sort of put forward that there is at times a competitive dynamic, like you said, that Avars overclaims, or 38 Degrees was also known for overclaiming it had, won this massive campaign that actually other groups had done the groundwork on. And I did see those competitive dynamics. I also saw emulation. I also saw Oxfam senior staffers saying, oh, we have to figure out how to do what they're doing. Greenpeace did that for sure. Kumi Naidoo, when he was head of Greenpeace, looked to what some of these groups and 350.org were doing to give more power to chapters, to give more power to members to start petitions, just like what you heard from Nate. And then there's also sometimes interesting symbiosis and collaboration, which I note, where actually the issue-based groups that have some level of expertise, whether it be Greenpeace on the environment, see a real utility in collaborating with these bigger digital advocacy organizations who have millions of members. And if you're quite a niche campaigning group, you might not have that big, broad membership. So there are instances in the book of where there have been collaboration. The third point I want to make, and I can obviously elaborate on these dynamics a bit more, is on the far right. And the Citizen Go example is really interesting because the project I'm just working on now asks the question, to what extent have right-wing actors copied this model? And we look at 4 cases, one of which is Citizen Go, which has actively copied Avars, and there's texts that we've seen that show that. There's a group in Germany, Patriot Petition, several groups in the US, and a group in Australia. And the short version is what we've found is that they have copied them at a moment when they've seen real power. So MoveOn was really strong in the Iraq War, and the right said, we want a conservative movement, like what MoveOn has done. But what they created was a much more top-down structure, from what we can see. I haven't done 5 years of ethnographic research in the far right, so this is based on what I've seen in publicly available websites. But what we do see is that the petitions, they don't seem to have a space where members can start their own petitions or put forward their own campaigns, which is what you would see if you went on to Organize, or what you would see if you went on to any of these other groups. So what appears to be happening is that it's much more top-down, that the right has a more hierarchical way of organizing than the left, but they're trying to channel this sort of participatory social movement discourse to claim to have a social movement around them. And they may have many members, we don't have a way of proving that. But I think there's a lot to be asked about these dynamics between the right and the left, and what's being learned, and not in a sense that the left wants it to be learned, but that there is a form of emulation or copying occurring.
Thank you so much.
Nice.
Can I pass it to Nat and Duncan? Or you get it.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting sort of remarks. I mean, Timson Hyman's really obsessed with the National Rifle Association, which obviously is not permissive in the sense of you can choose any campaign as long as it's about having more guns.
Yeah.
But within that, they are very permissive. So it's actually quite decentralized. There are people coming up with their own things.
Yeah.
So I think it'd be interesting to see whether that's true, that idea that it's top down. I'm coming back to this issue of analysis, right? Because saying they've realized that you need to get people out on the streets in major capitals and major powerful countries only really works if you can get so many people out on the streets that you can shift elections. I remember going on the big anti-Iraq war demo long ago, 2000, whenever it was, 3. And we thought we were going to change the world. There was 2 million people or 1 million people, depending who you believe, and it had absolutely no impact. And increasingly, certainly in the NGO world, we've realized that an outsider strategy without an insider strategy, where you're actually trying to convince the decision makers that doing certain things is in their interests, or reaching out to them through people who they fear or respect, a whole range of tactics which you use on the inside to complement the outsider strategy. Putting people on the streets is not power analysis. It's a kind of default tactic for popular mobilization, and it very rarely wins on its own. So I'm just interested, and you're pointing in the same direction, which is, and therefore organizations should look to ally with them, and they can provide the sort of people on the streets, and then other people can go in. I'll finish with this point, the dynamics between insider players and outsider players are usually quite unstable, because insiders love outsiders because it opens doors. They can go in. They can say, if you don't talk to us, you have to talk to those 2 million, shouting people outside. So it's brilliant if you're an insider. Outsiders tend to really not like insiders. They find insiders muddy the waters. They make deals. They settle for half the pie, not the whole pie. And so there's always a quite unstable relationship in these insider-outsider ones, which requires a massive amount of investment in relationships, communication, understanding, which doesn't sound like it's there from what you've said so far.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, as an outsider, I definitely don't invest in relationships with insiders because I don't see the gain. And I think the challenge we have is we move so quickly, which you alluded to earlier. By the time the insiders have turned around, like either it's been won or lost. And I think like a great example of that, so in my time at 38 Degrees, we're going back to sort of the national advocacy. There's a big campaign since 2015. There's a campaign around tax credits, and they wanted to cut tax credits, and we ended up winning a U-turn. And that was a classic example of, there were lots of people who've been working on this and doing classic insider tactics. And we did some very unnuanced, barraging, it looks like from the outside, mobilisation, but there was a lot of power analysis actually within our mobilisation. So we mobilised people in very marginal Tory constituencies and mobilising, single mums, people who would be really appealing to those politicians. And we targeted specifically the 1922 group of the Tories, so the most powerful Tory politicians. They're backbenchers, they have a lot of sway. And we flooded them with messages, tweets, and then people turning up at their surgeries. Over a 2-week period, so it's a really short response. At this point, a lot of the insiders wanted to set up a coalition. There was a coalition which we were part of, but we'd done all this prior to the first coalition meeting. And then I was at Westminster with one of our members delivering a petition. Faisal Islam, who was economics editor, I think, at the BBC at the time, came out and he was like, I knew him from a different thing. He was like, they won't stop talking about all the messages from 38 Degrees because they were flooded by these intentionally, and it wouldn't have made any difference if we'd have mobilised the whole country because they didn't care what most of the country thought. So I think when you couple the power analysis with outsider tactics, I think that's where it gets really exciting. But I think the challenge to it, I would say, is had that not won within 2 or 3 weeks, the momentum of that dies, and that's where you need to come back to the longer term strategies to carry on. It's kind of boom or bust, I think, a lot of this advocacy, and that's one of the big challenges with it. If it is bust, how do you pick people up? How do you go on to the next thing?
That's great, thank you. I'm going to put this water here so that our speakers can have a drink if they need something. Just 2 reflections on those really interesting comments. Nina, I think Sid Tarot would so love this project in the direction because his call to really, his response to that 90s transnational advocacy literature was really to look back at where is the target still in it. He always took us back to the nation state. And I think that your book provides a lot of evidence for that. On the Citizen Go, I'm a little bit more suspicious about whether it is that top-down and not supported. I think it depends on where are we talking about, which country is it hitting. And so I've been working with Christina Stöckel on this book on anti-gender mobilizations, and that is really an insider-outsider coalition. Citizen Go grows out of a very established transnational advocacy movement around World Congress of Families, et cetera, that fund it, they have politicians in governments. It's not like this platform is successful because it came out of nowhere. And it's hitting in many of the contexts where open is not, where some of the groups that you're talking about in some of the countries where that doesn't have traction, we do see other counter movements having more traction. And so I think there's a mix of nation states where we see, it's up for debate because both groups are really mobilizing people. And then in other countries, maybe one side is winning, the progressive movement has more of a base in the populace, but that can be the reverse for Citizen Go in other countries. It's one thing that I would just, quick reflection. My next question, and then I'll give you all a chance to reflect on that before turning it to the audience, is there are 2 related questions in terms of digital transnational advocacy. Who is left out when we think, and if we can go back to the progressive sphere now for this, and also, can they build community or are we just organizing individuals? And I think this connects to a lot of Duncan's points as well in terms of do we need the old and the new really to build a community? And here I'm thinking about a few things. So if you have a digital transnational advocacy, it could be that a lot of the frames that are used, since everyone has to click on them, and if the Bs aren't interesting, you move on to something else, they can really also tap into a more majority-based types of issues that a lot of people can get behind. But marginalized groups, if you think of an issue like same-sex marriage, which is accepted now, but was considered totally radical everywhere not long ago, those kind of issues needed a lot of work with insider-outsider coalitions, and really to build identity building and community building, they really needed a sustained movement of people that brought communities together and introduced to light in many different countries these kind of groups. So I'm wondering, what do you think? Can digital transnational advocacy do that, or does it really, is that a limit that we can't, when we think of marginalized groups, do we need the other, I guess, old-fashioned transnational advocacy to keep that all together? So I'll hand it in any order you like back to the panel.
Can I come in? Yeah, go for it. So I think there's two kind of really live examples in that. Talking about being like analytically driven, like there's a real challenge in that if you're looking for the majority, obviously you're not going to find that for marginalised issues. But what you can see in the analytics is a surge in the data. And so the refugee example that Nina had, I was working at 38 Degrees at the time. Refugees always ranked like number 10 or 11 on the list. And it was that summer where it was quite zeitgeisty, people were talking about it. And it was, I think, the 3rd of September 2015, that picture of Aylan on the beach, the toddler dead in the sand, was going viral. Everyone was talking about it. And you could just feel it. You could feel it in the air. I basically texted the whole staff team and I was like, I'm going in at 7. I don't think members are going to go for this, but I want to do something. I turned up at 7 o'clock, the whole team were there, and we just ran at it because it was the moment. It still wasn't popular. It still wasn't the majority of our members at that point who were behind it, but it was the most we were ever going to get. And we raised £100,000 that day, and then we raised $250,000 within 3 days, which was basically the foundational grant of the National Refugee Welcome Board, which now still exists, it's now called Safe Passage. But that was the outcome of that moment of the analytics saying, actually, this is the moment. And it wasn't a majority. And I think that's the thing you have to look for is when you've got a baseline in those stats, when it shifts, taking that opportunity, even if it's not a majority, to kind of get those issues that we know we want to push forward. And I think there's a challenge and a tension of that within the member-driven kind of nature. And I think different open organisations fall within the spectrum on how member-driven they are versus how value-driven they are.
Thank you.
Yeah, we've decided and then she can wrap up. So one of the things that was really inspiring when I joined the NGO scene was the Jubilee 2000 movement, which was a mass movement to drop the debt, to try and get the World Bank and the IMF to drop these massive debts that were crippling many countries, based in an obscure piece of scripture from the Bible, which talked about debt forgiveness. And one of the reasons why it was so effective was it was run by old churchgoers, right? Not the usual suspects. And they physically ringed the G7 movement in Birmingham in 1998 and changed the agenda of the meeting. The British government was hosting it, and they put that on the agenda because they'd all had to get through this ring of shouting OAPs, right, old age pensioners. And that makes me think, who is left out from this model is anybody who's rubbish at technology, right? And that's basically my generation. So I think, if you're in Dylan's generation, everything's fine. You can click, you live in this world, you're a digital native. And I dread to think where you'll get to in 10 years' time, Dylan. But you're missing out some of the people who politicians are most scared of. They're scared of old people because old people vote. They're scared of old people because old people stick with the campaign. They don't just move on. So that's one clear exclusion. We will get better as the really bad ones die off and other people sort of move into this demographic. But it is an issue. And then I was really interested in what you think, because it got me thinking about the Overton window. I don't know if people are familiar with the Overton window, but it's the window of what is publicly permissible in public debate, right? And so, 10 years ago, you couldn't talk about X. Now it's absolutely a thing. And I think what you were talking about, Nat, is that you could see something just coming into the Overton window, which is the art of the activist. And I guess the obvious conclusion is that these kind of campaigns won't move things from way outside the Overton window in, but when they're on the cusp of the window, they can bring them in and then make an enormous fuss. So other tactics are needed to move things, as you were saying with the Equal Marriage Campaign, that slog of talking to your neighbour, doing that viral conversation was what made the difference on equal marriage legislation in different places. So I'm going to say both and, as NGOs always say, right?
That's great. Thank you. Nina.
I'm actually going to surprise you, Duncan. You're exactly the typical member of these groups. This is the fascinating thing. Yeah, see, now
keep
it's
it
not
simple.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry to Dylan, but maybe he can be one day. But actually, this is what I've heard from all of the organizations, is that the typical member is educated, middle class, progressive, and a baby boomer.
Stop there.
And actually more women than men, but and that was certainly the groups that I met when I went into various offices that often be volunteers, and they would always fit that demographic. Nat can probably say more about it because I never had access for privacy reasons to all of the members. But I do think there is a question to be asked, which both of you said, who is excluded? And I think the model, there is a whole chapter that looks at where this organizational model spreads. And it is mostly to the global north. So there are a couple of global south examples. South Africa is one of them, Amanda Mobi, who have been relatively successful, but it has been more difficult for them to get member funding. So they've relied more on grants, which is a more typical development NGO model. But they have been very successful at mobilising particularly black women. That's been their constituency that they wanted to, and have used a lot of mobile tech. So they've been quite different, not using so much email petitions. And there have been attempts in Latin America to start up these groups. There's one at the moment in Brazil that's likely, it started off in Rio, that's likely to be part of this network. But there was one in Colombia, a woman who I interviewed and who's in the book, who found it really hard to set up the organization on her own. She's facing a lot of security threats to her life if she set up this organization. So there are a lot of countries, just like you said, in terms of repressive closing spaces where it's hard. And in fact, even some of the places where they are set up, like Hungary, like Poland, they are facing a lot of repression. But Eastern Europe, I think, is probably one of the most interesting stories in the book, because Romania, Hungary, Poland have really strong, really vibrant groups. And part of the answer I suggest in the book is because there's a cluster of groups that can learn from each other. So there's a neighborhood clustering effect, whereas in Latin America or in Asia or Africa, there just aren't that critical mass. But I think there's a lot more research to be done about exactly these questions, and I think you're completely right that all of the cases are working in democratic states. So it's not China, it's not Vietnam. There is a limit to this model, and there are other types of organization that probably need, and we need more research on this. So those of you who are sitting here, I invite you to do more on that. And the second and last point I just want to make is this question about to what extent can they really transform people's interests? Because the question that has been phrased in different ways, how much are they reacting? Just like Nat said, we're reacting to what the analytics tell us, and how much can we actually shift people? And the last chapter of my book looks at that exact question. And in fact, I had another slide, if I had had time, to say some of the groups are completely member-driven, and 38 Degrees fits pretty much into that. Other groups, like Action Station in New Zealand or Get Up, stuck to their refugee campaigns, even when it dipped. And I have a comparison between exactly that, looking at how over time Get Up actually helped. It was one of many organisations to try and shift Australian refugee policy to close all of the detention centres. And they did that not because there were high analytics, because heaps of people in Australia were like, yeah, we really want to change our refugee policy. They had to transform people's preferences. And that to me is one of the really interesting tensions in the model and how it's evolving. So the book is also not just about how this model was formed, but how people within this network who are thinking about activism are changing and evolving the model itself. So that's why I invite you to read the book, learn more.
Brilliant, thank you so much. All right, let's turn to the floor now for questions, and we'll have some mics here. So I think we have a question right up here.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for your chat. Also, a lot of questions that I had were actually answered, so I really enjoyed the discussion. So your book asks how. My main question would be more normative, should, right? So should data sway decisions that much? Right, so data is neutral, but our interpretation of them is not. So I wonder, you show how much impact there is and how much those conversations, political conversations can be said. You mentioned as well how this can be utilized by negative movements as well, but in the moment we may not even know what negative and positive is, and this transnational level to it as well makes it feel as though we from the north are telling people everywhere else, this is the biggest problem right now, we've decided it, data decided it. So should this be kind of monitored more by policy, or should this be accepted as something that is happening? Is this a problem or is this a solution?
Thank you. We have a question in the back and another question.
Yes, I had a question for Duncan. You said that the NGO model can't be used in every country. Do you think that that's contingent on the political situation?
Sorry, I didn't catch it. Could you hold the mic closer?
Sorry, yes. You said that the NGO model can't be exported to every country with success. Is that contingent on the political system? So if you were to say try to graph it, would you say the more authoritative a political regime is, the less effective the NGO model is? Or would that be like an aspect of infrastructure? So is it very much possible in the Western world, because everyone has access to an internet connection, everyone has a phone, everyone has a car to mobilize themselves? So do you think it's more the political system that conditions the operational success of an NGO, or is it more the actual economic situation, level of infrastructure and development? Thank you.
Okay. My question is very similar to something that was already raised. Like one of the biggest problems with most social platforms these days is that of fake news and bots. So I would like to, I'm curious about how this whole system is resilient against something of that sort. Like for example, in India a few years ago, Facebook tried to mount a huge advocacy to get a program called Free Basics going. So it got a lot of support from people. They kind of claimed it as a beneficial program for poor people. But in fact, it was later proved that it was like their vested interest. They just wanted to control the internet. It's still debatable, but like it's still a thing. So when you talk about analyzing analytics, like or just like looking for searches and analytics and like that shaping advocacy, how resilient is the system to like something like fake news or like something where people are like led in the wrong way? So.
All right, so we'll go back to the panel now.
I'll just take my one.
Okay.
You take yours.
All right. On the third point, the whole question of how do we regulate the internet is a really big and important question. And interestingly, most of the groups weren't that active on internet regulation campaigning, although it came up frequently as a theme. Should, say, 38 Degrees open campaign on Facebook, given all of the problems that you are highlighting? There were a few exceptions, and I know of some activists in India who did some campaigning around the free basics work. So I think there are instances where groups have been working on it, and they're certainly outside of the network of groups that I study, groups that are campaigning on it. But I think it probably gets a little bit to this question of what kinds of campaigns are easy and successful at mobilising a lot of people, because this is what the groups that I study do well. And a lot of the regulation required around this is quite technical, and it's hard to mobilise people. And so that would be my analysis of why there's been less campaigning from the groups that I study, is because it's hard to mobilise people. There's not a clear answer. On should data sway decisions? Great question. This is at the heart of a lot of the reflection within the groups that I study. And what digital advocacy organizations have realized is that their model makes it easy to campaign for majority issues, but much harder for minority rights. And they all identify as progressive. And so then what does it mean to be progressive if you're putting up positions for a majority vote? And over time, what's happened is that the groups have said actually staff need to have often more of a deciding role in shaping or deciding, even if there isn't a whole majority who's behind something, that they'll try and shift people's preferences. So I don't think you should walk away from my talk saying that every organization is completely and only swayed by data. I think what they do distinct from other NGOs like Oxfam and Greenpeace is that they're set up to gather a lot of data, to listen to their members. But how they use it is the question. And some of them just react. Some of them are very reactive. There was a very controversial decision that 38 Degrees took around Brexit, where they polled their members, and there wasn't, as I understand, Nate probably knows the inside better.
Left by them.
All right, a clear enough majority, either for or pro Brexit. So 38 Degrees, even though all of the staff, to my knowledge, were very, very pro-Remain, staying in the EU, the organisation decided, because its membership was split, to be neutral and to campaign neither for nor against. Now, as I understand that decision, again, I wasn't in all of those meetings, that's where the data was swaying, and they weren't saying as staff, we're going to take a position and we're going to say, as an organisation, we want to stay, the UK to stay in the EU, and we're going to shift our membership. So they were swayed, and there was a lot of pushback across the network for that decision that was taken. The reason I highlight that is because for me, as a political scientist and IR scholar, I think there's been a lot of emphasis on algorithms, on data, but not on the politics, the formal institutions, the hierarchies, and the decision-making that happens in the digital sphere. And that's partly because the methods that a lot of people are using is to scrape a lot of data off websites and do sophisticated social network analysis or understand things, but not actually going and talking to people who are making decisions. So this is more a bit of a quibble for me with some of the methods used in the discipline. But great question. Yeah.
I might jump in on that. One other factor I think that's really important is, like, when we haven't really touched on it yet, the business model of these organisations. So in that example, like, you know, if you, as a global, like Avaz, I used to work at Avaz years ago, but, you know, most of their income comes from the global north, and they want to advocate and say, yes, you might use the data of the global south to drive your policy, but the tension comes, and you saw it there with the refugees versus bees. Like, refugees, we had 1 week where it made loads of money, and then it never made any money again. And bees, you send a bees email, you make $100 grand in a heartbeat. Like, you just need a cute picture of a bee. You can do a lot of bee puns. That makes a lot of money, and like that's a real tension, because it's like, actually you want to be doing, you know, actions that drive impact, but also these organisations are member funded, so they need to be doing actions that drive revenue as well, and that's a big tension in the model, I think.
Which is not that different from the traditional NGOs, right? I mean, we're primarily member funded, especially for the last few years. We haven't had any UK government funding, and so if we go out way beyond where the membership's at, that will affect our revenue. So yeah, it's not that different. Yeah, funding is another vote, is another form of voting, isn't it? Your question on NGO model in authoritarian states, there's no question it's harder. It's usually harder in countries like Vietnam or Ethiopia or Russia to engage with the state. But I think that my point was, we have a kind of model for doing that, which can be quite successful. One of the weirder things I've noticed is that if you're doing advocacy in places like Russia or Vietnam, evidence is more effective than if you're using evidence in Britain, right? Because providing it's not system threatening, if it's below the radar, and you're providing the bureaucrats with clear evidence of how to improve policy or services, they will listen. They don't have as much noise in their ears as people have in big democracies. So you can use other insider tactics, which we've developed over the years, but don't get me wrong, it's very difficult out there. The space, in particular for international organizations, big and international organizations become a liability in many countries. The governments say you're just agents, foreign agents, you know, we only want to hear from national organizations. And then once the international ones have left, they then shut down the national ones, you know. So it's very difficult, but it is part of the repertoire. And I don't see an obvious repertoire in what you're talking about for doing it through this other model. So.
Thank you so much. We have time for another round of questions. Let's see. All right, in the white shirt, and then in front, 2 rows down in the black sweater.
Thank you very much for the talk. I've got a question about how these organisations go about prioritising and selecting causes or cause areas. The refugee bee example suggests that it might be pretty problematic and suboptimal at the moment. And if you perhaps take inspiration or know anything about the effective altruism movement, if you think there are any lessons to be learned from them, or maybe not. Thank you.
My question is about advocacy and burnout. So we kind of see spike in petitions and things like that around big events, but it's not sustained advocacy. So, like, for example, in the US, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, we saw huge petitions going around by different organizations and things by, digital advocacy as well. But it's not sustained in the way that perhaps traditional organizations are, like Planned Parenthood or Narwhal or whatever. So in your work or in your research, did you find anything that investigates burnout or investigates retention rates among members where you see them care about a certain issue, but that you don't see them necessarily translate into other issues or even sign petitions of the same issue in later events or later kind of periods of that issue? Thank you.
Great. We have another question right down here.
Thank you very much for the session. I do have a question around the whole digital era. I think there is some emphasis on the digital part, data, research data, making sense of the data as well. And I'm just wondering, how important are the current and progressive digital architectures and landscapes? Because there's a lot of progressing in that area, and there's a lot of technologies growing, and whether we're talking about AI, blockchain, or cybersecurity spaces. Maybe that's too much for that specific part, but how important are those digital architectures and digital ecosystems for addressing causes and doing an impact in that space?
All right, thank you very much. I'll turn it back to the panel, maybe a minute and a half each for your closing remarks.
Okay. Should I go? Yeah.
No, you've got to do the
All right.
rousing.
I've got to do the rousing final hurrah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go on then.
I've forgotten the question. Can you remind me what
All right,
The-
okay. While they're working out, I'll talk to one, which is the petition fatigue point that you're talking about. This is really interesting, I think. I don't think NGOs or digital have got this right. The NGOs, someone once characterized the typical NGO campaign report as bad shit, facty, right? Which was a horrendously accurate description of most of the things I've written over the years. And it's based on data, it's based on a grim picture, it's based on polarizing and othering, the bad guys, and it doesn't tap into deep narratives of change. And there's been some really good critiques saying that the NGOs have failed to notice where people's big narratives of change come, which is from faith, often from faith. Time and time again, Oxfam, very secular in the way it works, but the actual Oxfam activists and staff are often motivated by their faith, all different faiths. So I think we haven't worked out what makes people show up, and I don't think these guys have either. And that's so I do worry about that fatigue, which sets in, especially if it's that transient that things are moving constantly. Yeah.
Cool. I've now been told the questions that I'd forgotten. The first one on campaign selection. So I think it comes back to that point about being member-driven. So the campaigns can build momentum on their own. There's no gatekeeping in that sense. But in terms of what you then put the energy of the network behind, if it's not getting the metrics, it might get more exposure in the network. So I know MoveOn, for example, have a robot essentially that tests. It sends it to 200 people. What are the metrics like? 1,000, 5,000. And obviously that can be really problematic because if it's not making those thresholds, it can be get less of an audience essentially. And if you look at something like Change.org, slightly different model, but they use this concept of promoted petitions, which we're going to explore as well. Of you can basically put your money where your mouth is and pay for more exposure, and that can be a business model. And I think the real challenge is that is the tension you've highlighted. It is quite problematic, but also I think it removes some of the challenges around grant funding, which can also be quite problematic. In that grant funding often comes with strings of what you have to campaign on, and particularly the theory of change you have to use, and it can be quite in tension with what the actual beneficiaries or the people on the ground want. And so I think there's a real benefit to member funding, but there's a real challenge in how do you strike that balance? You basically have a finite pot of member funding, and you spend capital on stuff that's maybe more progressive but less income generating, and then you also have to compromise and run some things that do generate the income to give you that capital to spend. So it's a tension, but I think it's I'd rather have that than grant funding, if I'm being brutally honest. And then in terms of the fatigue, we see it all the time, and it's actually something that we work a little bit with the guy. This is a bit rogue. The guy who did Candy Crush, the game on your phone, and he talks about one of the things that we're trying to build into our activism is this concept of variable reward. So one of the things that makes Candy Crush so successful is that when you first play the game, you get a mystery prize box, and if that mystery prize box contains a massive prize, for the rest of the time you're playing Candy Crush, you will probably never see a prize that big again. but you are chasing that reward. And you can apply those principles to activism. If your first engagement with activism is actually you experience a real high and some real impact, you're going to be chasing that high again, and you're not going to burn out. You probably will burn out, but you're going to keep coming back, right? And so it's like, how can we build those principles of like gamification and other things into our activism that build confidence and power and get us through those difficult months? So that's something we're thinking about.
One more comment on the burnout point is that it's not just the members, but also the staff. Because obviously campaigning in rapid response mode and waking up and going, everyone in the office at 7 a.m. in the morning, we have to make a decision now, it's all go, 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 we've got to chase this moment. This was this thing that came up often in my, in the sidelines of the conversations I was having. And because you can't plan campaigns in a way, even, I recognize any kind of campaigning is stressful, but like an Oxfam, at least you can say at the start of the year, well, we've got Davos, we need to have this report on, poverty and inequality by then, we've got this other summit, we've got this national decisions. You can kind of plan out your year to a certain extent at the beginning, and then you react within what's happening. But this model is based on the fact that the staff in these organizations are waking up in the morning and going, what's at the top of the analytics? What's the top survey? Okay, now we have to run the campaign. We have to learn about something completely new. It's an exhausting model. And I should also note that the book isn't supposed to be a celebration of all of these organizations as having the answer. The book is supposed to say, we know a lot about Oxfam and Greenpeace and traditional NGOs. There's still more to be known, but we've, in international relations, learned very little about these other actors. And to me, one of the points of writing the book is to understand the whole ecology of different kinds of advocacy. It's not to say one is better than the other or one's about to replace. I'm not suggesting in the book that digital advocacy organizations like 38 Degrees or MoveOn or Get Up are going to replace, that there is a real role for traditional NGOs that commit on a long term to certain issues. For me, the question is just more about the different roles that they can play in an ecosystem, and understanding deeply that digital technologies are also enabling new forms of organization to occur. So in answering your question directly, how important are progressive tech? There have been a few individuals, one who I name in the book, Nathan Woodhull, who's been a critical tech developer, who goes to all of the open summits and asks them, what tech do you need? And has helped set up control shift labs, basically the back-end technology so that members can set up their own petitions. And there are, I'm sure, other people within particular country contexts. And one of the things with all these organizations is that they have good tech staff. They're not just campaigners. They have people who they hire in order to be able to do the kind of campaigning. So yes, there's a very critical role, and there's others who've written on like the role of Lumio and Occupy and other digital platforms. But yeah, if there's one, I guess, message that you take away from the book is understanding that digital politics, there is many different ways that digital technologies are shaping and enabling new things, but it's also up to humans to decide how and if they use them, and not just in terms of regulating, but in terms of decision making. If you are given a bunch of data saying the bees are more important than refugees, what do you do with that data? And that's a human decision. And I think, that's something that the book kind of ends and reflects on. Yeah, thanks.
What a great note to end such a thoughtful, informative, and really inspiring session. Thank you to all of our speakers, and please join me in thanking you. I would also like to thank you for joining us tonight, and thank my colleagues Fergus Green and Eleanor Kinswell-Banham for their help in putting on this event. If you are interested in these events, you can follow us on our Twitter handle, which is UCLSPP, or Twitter, Instagram, we're on there. And the next event that we have, which is at this time next week, is, and it goes back to one of our questions, you might be interested, it's called What Next After Roe versus Wade? The New Divide Over Abortion Rights in America. And so it will be here next Thursday. Thank you all for coming. Bye.